The big hand and the little hand are on their respective good places to tell us that it is now 2000 UTC, which is 8 o'clock somewhere, but 4 o'clock in Philadelphia. It's time to start IETF114 Dmarc working group session. I'm Barry Leva. You see on the screen Seth Seth Blank, and we are the co-chairs. Here we go. Our agenda for the day, some intro and admin stuff. And then we go look at the issues. Closure on the tree walk issue, which I hope we can get in a reasonably short time here. We've been batting that around a lot on the mailing list. An issue that I'm raising on how to talk about mailing list interoperability in the BIS spec. And then whatever other issues we have. Todd has one or two maybe. I think whatever it is will be quick. And then discussion on the two reporting docs for whatever time we have left and whether there's anything to talk about on them. We have a 1-hour session here. So we'll start with the administration stuff with the slide with the very small writing. Note the note well. It is telling you what your responsibilities are with respect to intellectual property rights declarations and that sort of thing. If you are unfamiliar with any of it, please read up on it. You should be well familiar with it by now, I think. Meeting tips for this meeting, and we will enforce this. Make sure you sign on to the session using the MeetEcho Lite client if you're in the room, and put yourself in the microphone queue by raising your hand in that tool. Otherwise, we will not recognize you, even if you are recognizable. You can get there by, oh, well, yes, we don't have, somewhere in the room, there's probably something to scan that has a QR code. Yeah, on the backs of some of the chairs, or you can do it from the meeting agenda. Let's see. Oh, yes, and wearing masks. Please do wear your masks even when you're at the microphone. The microphones have been picking people up very well, unless you are standing up here at this mic or this one, in which case we presume you are socially distanced and you're just spewing your germs on the microphone for the next person to eat. Remote participants, please make sure your audio and video are off except for Seth. When you are not speaking, and please turn your video on if you don't mind when you are speaking so that we can see your smiling faces. Okay. So the purpose of this meeting is to resolve whatever remaining issues we have on the Dmarc BIS draft. We hope that we can get this finished sometime very soon. And so is the agenda that I showed you before, which we see again here. Okay, does anyone have any bashes for the agenda? Anything you want to add? Anything you want to change? Seeing nothing, let's get started. Tree walk. Is the text in version 14, which you've obviously read through entirely because Todd posted it as long ago as last night, is the text there what we want? Are there any other changes needed? We've been tweaking this a little bit here and there. So there, John, do you think that the current version is correct? Are there any other tweaks that you're aware of? Tim.
Tim Wasinski, we're up to 15, and I posted the diff in the hedge doc so folks can compare 13 to 15 to look at the tree walk example. So,
excellent, thank you.
So you're a version behind, Barry, sorry.
I'm a version behind. I made these slides yesterday, so.
John?
So Jim says if we're, should we be using the version that was just posted too recently for people to have read?
I was about to describe what the difference was.
And
since it's some text
John will take care of that by telling you what's changed.
Yes. The only thing I changed was the there were a bunch of tree walk examples. The one that used a PSD was extremely simple. So I made it slightly more complicated. So you now have mega.bank.example and giant.bank.example, where bank.example is it's a PSD, and mega bank has a Dmarc record and giant bank doesn't. And one does a tree walk. Yeah, sorry. So it does a tree walk up from mail.mega and finds that it's aligned, and then it does a tree walk up from mail.giant and finds that it's not aligned because they're parallel under the PSD. So I believe that is about as complicated a PSD example as is anywhere close to reality. And I think it points out what the PSD flag does that makes the tree walk different. So I think as far, and other than that, we've had endless discussions and nothing else. I haven't seen anything else that needs to change. So I hope we're done.
Okay, thanks, John, for the summary. I agree from your description, not having read it myself, but from your description, I agree that's the kind of example I was looking for. So thank you. Tim.
Tim Wazinski, I agree with John. I love that example of his, that complicated one. My only comment would be, do we need like a bad example? Like, so in a lot of our DNS docs, we always have like, this is like not the thing to do, right? And we show people like, and I'm wondering if that's just going to give people like bad ideas. So,
okay. So John, back to you.
Yeah, having actually gone through the PS.
Yeah, it's working.
Yeah, having gone through the PSL to see what examples are plausible, I think it is very unlikely that anybody would do a more complicated example other than to make some sort of point. So in this particular case, I'm falling out on the side of don't show them more complicated stuff because they're unlikely to think about it otherwise, and it would be a bad idea.
Yeah, and I think, Tim, that the only thing, an example of what not to do would probably be just putting PSD equals Y when you shouldn't. And I don't think we can really make an example that shows that. So, yeah. Seth.
Is rereading everything in fine detail this morning, and I went back to the original use cases we talked about when we talked about the tree walk, and I think we may have something to discuss that is potentially a wrench, but I think it has to do with the max depth of n, and the way it's currently written is you jump. If the number of labels is greater than 5, you lop off a bunch and move to the widest labels. And I think that's the cleanest way to do it, because you have a very explicit determination at the end of that. You've reached a TLD. If you've walked the whole way, there's no policy. You do not have to apply Dmarc to the message flow. I think the problem with that is the complex organization use case. That was one of the explicit reasons for the tree walk, which is the federal government use case, then the university use case, which is I have sub-organizations within sub-organizations with complex sending environments, and the Dmarc reports jump the person who can actually do something about that. So just to use a real example, right? It's the U.S. Secret Service, right? USSS.DHS.gov. And then they have their own department under that, and then a sender, and then a subdomain the sender's sending on under that. And if it's more than 5 labels, cut and jump, we actually miss the use case of that walking up to the appropriate department. The same thing in a university with a math department and sub-departments under it. And if we just walk for 5 and then stop, I think that actually solves the problem, but then it creates a separate issue, which is, right, if you have the abuse use case of a.b.c.d.e.f ... domain, you could walk through 5, say, I'm done, but there could still be a Dmarc policy then that you never get to that says reject the message. And so it's a lot less clean, and there's a trade-off there. But I am concerned about that, the big company with suborgs and suborgs, which was one of the explicit reasons we talked about the tree walk in the first place, that we would cut off their ability.
John?
Yeah, this came up before, and Scott and I talked about it. And the reason we picked 5 is because the deepest label that has ever been in the PSD is only 4. The deepest name that has ever been in the PSL is only 4. You know, if you
Oh
if you
yeah, I'm
really-
100% aligned with 5 being the max depth we walk, and I completely agree.
Oh.
We've been through all the data that's sort of the most labels. The
Yeah.
problem is from where, right? That's on the PSD side. On the how many nest organizations do I have?
No.
John means 5 from the root.
5 from the root. That's the deepest label ever put in the PSL is 4 from the root, which is why we did 5.
Right.
Okay, and the problem with doing it in the other direction is just what you said. You put in a long junk name and you hide. You know, like if people if you really believe you can find a case where 6 labels would work better than 5, I don't care if it's 5 or 6 or 7, so long as it's a small integer. I mean, I just at this point, label more than 5 still seems awfully hypothetical. And the thing is, like, I know that there are these deep names inside organizations, but but those deep names tend not to be different organizations. They just tend to be a lot of names within the same organization, in which case the jump doesn't hurt.
Murray.
Yeah, 2 things. If anybody, I'm trying to plan ahead for when this lands on my desk and I start working it toward the ISG. If one of them asks why 5, does the document have a good answer for that?
Well, that's the answer that Murray can give his colleagues. The
Right.
question is, should that be in the document?
Right. So that,
The answer to that might be no, but
yeah, I'm asking the question.
it will at least go into the Shepherd write-up. But
Okay. I came up here with another question. Oh yeah. So, and I'm glad Tim's here because he might be able to. Let's, in similar vein, when we get it and someone says, "Oh, a tree walk, that's pretty weird." Did anybody talk to the DNS people about this? Should DNS Deer look at this? Should we? So
this can be a test case for the new DNS directorate.
the new old DNS directory. Oh, yeah.
And there are several people who look like sketchy DNS people in here. So
Okay. So we could just, I'll plan to send it to you.
Tim's off-mic answer was there are several people in the room who are DNS folks, and he said sketchy ones, but I don't think you're that sketchy. So it is being watched by the DNS crowd.
We count on you being sketchy. So I'll just plan to send it to them. Thanks.
Yep. Todd.
First, with Murray's question, I mean, we can take an issue to add explanation as to why it was chosen as 5, right? But
well, the question is whether we should. It's it might be adequate to just put it in the Shepherd write-up so the ISG doesn't ask the question. Is there value in an archival document to having it documented there? And I don't. We'd have to discuss that a bit more.
Okay. But I just want clarity on what Seth was proposing, because I didn't hear, at least in an earlier conversation. Can I speak?
yeah, sorry.
Thank you. I didn't hear that he was asking to change from 5 to 6 to 7. I heard that he was asking to not do a jump, just do 5 lookups starting with the leftmost label, and I think
if you go back,
John, go ahead and go to the microphone for it.
I will have to look in the mail archive, but I know we thought about that, and I think we have a record of why we decided not to.
Okay, so we will resolve that offline. Ale.
I think there are some little tweaks that are actually needed, because it was changed, the algorithm of how to find the organizational domain, and it is not foolproof the way it is written, and some sentences look wrong. So maybe we should have another round of possible changes to propose to the working group.
Okay, I think at this point, If you think that other changes are needed, that the right answer is to post specific text that you want to see changed, and then the editors will consider that. So, Tim
Wasinski, I was actually starting to think about who was going to do the Shepherd's write-up, but I'm offering to write some text for the Shepherd's write-up on the DNS portion of it, sort of thing, if that will actually help Mr. Murray, the AD. So, okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Tim, are you also just willing to be the shepherd?
I could probably shepherd this.
Okay.
Did I shepherd PSD? I think, no. Yeah.
Great. Thank you.
Twist my arm, yeah.
The chairs
So,
appreciate that.
okay.
Thank you. All right. Is there any other discussion on the tree walk?
No, I wanted to just thank the editors for the added example. It made it very clear. And so thank you.
Yes, I thank them too. Okay, well, seeing no further discussion on the tree walk, I think just pending the resolving whether we need to say something more about the issue Seth raised, we're done. So, John, why don't you and Seth sort out offline Seth's question, and then we'll go from there. All right.
Later today or tomorrow.
Or next week would be fine also, but whatever.
I'll be home tomorrow.
John will be home tomorrow. He can do it. So whatever it is, you guys will sort it out. Report back to the mailing list when it's done. And now the issue I wanted to raise, we have a little bit in section 8.5 that mentions the breakage we get in mailing lists from Dmarc P equals reject policies, and the reference to RFC 6377, which we published a while ago. Is that enough? And my view, now I guess I should say this from the floor, Mike, but I don't really like the jumping up and down. As a participant, not as a chair, my view is that I don't feel right putting this out as proposed standard with something that blatantly breaks a long time protocol that we've used on the internet for dealing with mailing lists. So I think that we need to make some normative statement that Dmarc P equals reject policies are not intended to be used on domains that may post to mailing lists and stuff like that. The intent of P equals reject was for transactional mail sorts of things, not for arbitrary people sending arbitrary email to places on the internet. I think we need to make such a statement. I prefer at a BCP 14 keyword level using a should not. So my proposal is to have something in there saying that you should not use P equals reject under these kinds of circumstances, and that it's intended for this sort of use, and we'd have to sort out what the text is. And I'd like to start a discussion on that. Murray's the first in the queue.
So we talked about this a little bit last night, and I'm generally supportive of using BCP 14 to say this. In the sense that I would also be willing to defend it to the ISG if they said, well, this is, if they resist its use. So I'm supportive of that. Since we're talking about 6377, and since that came out some number of years ago, is there anything in it that is stale that we should consider commenting on? Like, is that still enough, or do we need to say more than that? Has the advice of 6377 evolved at all? I'm just wondering if it's an old reference that we should update.
Okay, Pete.
Anyone want to answer Murray's question?
Well, I think it needs a little more thought before we give a knee-jerk answer. I'd have to go look at it and see.
Pete Resnick. I guess one question I would have is, given your framing that this particular behavior of P equals reject with email, with the caveat that the email is not transactional, will cause problems. Why is it not just a must not?
An excellent question.
And, 2119 is clear on this. If it's going to cause damage, and, 2119 uses the example of, lots of bad retransmissions. But this is mail will bounce if you do this. Implementers need to be warned about that. You must not do it if these conditions happen to be the case.
Well, I have sympathy for that. And what we often do in the IETF is use should not when we know that must not will be ignored, or when we think that it will be it will be difficult to get consensus with it. And I've always sort of bristled at that approach. So I have some sympathy for what Pete just said. Something else for us to discuss. Seth.
Go first.
Sorry, go ahead. What?
Why doesn't John go first?
Oh, okay, John.
Yeah, everything you say is right, but I am concerned that since pretty much every mailing list in the world has implemented various hacks to work around Dmarc breakage, if we just say don't do it, we'll look stupid. So, or out of touch, or like, oh yeah, that's those ivory tower graybeards of the IETF who don't know how the internet actually works. So, I suppose we could say should not, and then the sentence after that, something, a more tactful way of saying, but since I know you're going to do it anyway, there are widely used workarounds which we're not going to describe here.
Okay. Seth, you want Pete to jump in first?
Sure, I'll go after Pete.
So this is Pete Resnick. First of all, I think John overstates the case. It is not that all mailing lists solve this problem. Most now have hacked around it, but there are still some. I still get bounces. And I think it is fair for the document to say there are mailing lists, many mailing lists, most mailing lists, I don't care which we say, do work around this by changing the from field in ways that remove the original information, but be absolutely clear that you're removing the original information. It is a hack. It is unnecessary if people implemented it correctly. I don't object to more explanation as to why it says must or should not. And I agree with you, Barry, should not when there is absolutely no explanation for why you might do it the other way reasonably is kind of just
waffling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But put in as much explanation of the state of affairs as you like, but the instruction should be don't do that.
Yeah, I've put myself in the queue later to say something similar, but Seth, go ahead.
So I strongly disagree on the tell people not to, but I do agree there's a very real problem. Like, I think we must address the breakage, and I think in the charter we must address the breakage for this document to move. And so as chair, there is something material that we must have in the document about the impact of Dmarc on forwarded mail streams with good guidance. So I'm strongly in agreement there as chair. As an individual, I think what we've seen as an ecosystem, mailing lists aside for a second, is that Dmarc is valuable in an enormous number of players, and the mailboxes all say we desperately want all mail to come in with a Dmarc policy, and specifically one that tells us how to handle unauthenticated mail. And so I think we're doing a disservice to the power and efficacy of the standard by telling people not to use it. I do think if we can separate, like if we can wave a magic wand, say ARC is well deployed and the forwarded mail case is used, we wouldn't be it is managed, we wouldn't be having this conversation. And my question is, do we need to dig into that with ARC and what's needed there to materially complete this? Or do we need to say, hey, here's what we've done, it's not yet ready. Mailing lists could rewrite the from. I know that will piss off people, but there are options that address this, and then say, and you should take, if you are moving to a policy of reject or quarantine, you should understand the impact on any mail you said that goes through forwarded channels. But it's not don't do it, it's understand what you're doing and both the benefit of having Dmarc and the impact on forwarded mail streams. But I'm very against, as an individual, a must not or a should not here, because I think the value and the whole point of the protocol is to protect your domain from spoofing.
Okay, Jim?
Hi, Jim Fenton. I strongly agree with Pete's comment. I forget who made it, somebody's earlier comment that IETF will look stupid telling people not to use something that we published before. I think much the opposite. Some of the people who have deployed it, DHS, I'm looking at you, or mandated it, DHS, I'm looking at you, are stupid for mandating something that was an informational RFC, and they should be. I mean, maybe we need to make it clearer to people which RFCs are informational and which ones are standard track. But that got really far along, became a federal government mandate to publish P equals reject, and it shouldn't have happened. So IETF coming back and saying what you did before was not the right thing to do, I think is the right statement to make.
So just before you sit down, I believe that John's statement wasn't along the line of you shouldn't have implemented the early version. It's more that he's basically saying we know that people are finding value in Dmarc the way they're the way they've deployed it, and they're not going to change. So we would look stupid telling them they must. John, is that pretty accurate? So it's more that we would be saying something that we know they're not going to pay attention to, and that's what would make us look silly.
Well, in fact, I think it should be a must not, because a lot of these organizations are very compliance oriented, and a should not will not cause a compliance breakage, but a must not will.
Okay, thank you. So I'm in the queue next, and perfect, because I can respond to Seth. Again, as a participant, I think we're still acknowledging that Dmarc is important, and that what we're just saying is that a strict Dmarc policy like P equals reject was intended for a specific use case, and it's being used beyond that. We know that no matter what we say, as John says, no matter what we say, or some organizations will continue to use it the way they are and will be happy with the results they're getting. But I can't in good conscience approve putting out a proposed standard that breaks a major protocol on the internet, that we know breaks a major protocol on the internet, and that asks every mailing list on earth to put in a workaround that avoids the breakage. So I think we need to say how the protocol ought to work, and then accept that it's going to be deployed in other ways by some, because we don't have, I'm sorry, I don't have Warren's little badge. We don't have the Internet Protocol Police. So that's my response to that. Ale.
I think we must consider that putting P equal none is almost ineffective. Well, it allows people to get some reports, but it is not an actual use of Dmarc protocol. And on the other side, on the IETF, we do most of our work using mailing lists. And we are standardizing Dmarc without actually using it. It makes makes me feel a little stupid, as John said. I think mailing lists can adapt as they do, And there are counter hacks that can operate in order to put things back the way they were. And solution will come, but saying that people must not use Dmarc is not going to work, is bad, in my opinion. Thank you.
I don't think anyone is saying we shouldn't use Dmarc. And I will tell you that as a mailing list administrator of a number of IETF mailing lists, despite the workaround that we've deployed, I'm still getting every week unsubscribed, forced unsubscribed because of this problem. And that's with the workaround in place. So I'm not sure why, but there it is. Bron.
Bron Gondwana here. Definitely, I think we need to find a pathway for ARC. At the moment, there's no way as an intermediate to know whether the receiver accepts ARC. I haven't been trying to bring that work here just yet or find someone who wants to do that work because we're trying to get this stuff done. But I think that is probably the next thing this working group will need to look at. I think it's probably going to be a DNS record on the receiving MX to say, I can handle ARC, so you don't need to rewrite. Looking at it, I think that's the only way that you could make this work realistically. Otherwise, you're doing it at SMTP transaction time, and by then, most places have already done the processing they're planning to do before they open the SMTP transaction. So there needs to be some way of knowing, of bootstrapping ARC, because at the moment we have to wait for the whole world to support it before we can switch off rewriting, and that's not really viable.
Do we have any data from anyone who's implemented ARC?
Don't believe so. There's not many implementations out there yet. Gmail has some, we have some, but there's not much. There's not many people doing ARC in between, and so everyone's still rewriting.
Just jumping in for 1 second, Microsoft just released a huge ARC update recently, and so I think they're willing to share a bunch of data. I'm trying to pull them over to the working group, so we should have data.
Yes, I have a suggestion about this, which is inspired by
and John, you're next in the queue anyway,
Yes,
so
I
there
know.
you go.
So inspired by what Jim said, the problem is calling it mailing list interoperability misses the point. I think the problem, the issue we need to point out is that if you ask people to enforce Dmarc, some of your real mail will get lost. And the example I'm thinking of is I host the mail for my town government, and I have a small enough mail server that I actually look at the bounces from time to time. And I saw, like, they were getting mail from the U.S. Census in 2020, which was really important for them. It was P equals reject. It only used SPF. It did not have DKIM signatures, and I forwarded their mail to Gmail, which was of course rejecting it all. So I think rather than saying don't use, like, rather than saying, basically, rather than insulting people, rather than implicitly insulting people who use workarounds on mailing lists, I would phrase this to say that the cost of using Dmarc is that some of your legitimate mail will get lost, and perhaps slightly anonymize a mailing list example in the example I just gave, and say, so be aware, be aware of that if you decide to enforce a policy. And in some cases, such as mailing lists, there may be back end workarounds which are beyond the scope of our discussion. Yeah, I think we can say that, sound reasonable, and basically we can say that without denying what people do, while still making it clear that there is a problem, and if you just do this naively, you may be sorry.
Okay, Pete.
Pete Resnick. People always misunderstand what 2119 words mean. We have voluntary standards in this organization. By saying must not, again, there are no protocol police. No one's going to stop anybody from doing this, much less stop them from dorking with their retransmission timers in TCP, which they continue to do. The reason you say must not is because you're saying this will cause damage. If some people interpret that as a conformance requirement, not our problem. And God bless them if it does, right? If they interpret it as, oh, the IETF said I can't do that, therefore I must stop. Well, they're silly, but Good, let them feel that way. The reason we say these things in standards is to explain when you should, can, may, must do certain things to protect the network. And what our must means in this organization is if you don't do this, damage will occur. Must not means if you do this, damage will occur. Let's be clear about that. I mean, even what Seth pointed out, which is we should say that, you know, there are reasons you might choose to do otherwise. That is by definition what 2119 says is should not. So if we agree with what Seth said, then we should use should not in the document. I happen to think we can be stronger, but let's not try and not use the tools that we have in this organization because some people might misunderstand them and then therefore think we're silly. I think that's not a good reason to do that.
Trent?
Yeah. So many points I wish I was in the room to make because every one of the speakers had something amazing to say. Speaking just to Pete, I agree with that. I think that setting the context at the top of the document and saying, look, this is the context, then the shoulds, the musts, and mays all fall into place, right? Which means that if you want to employ this and you want to use the protections it provides, saying must is within that context, right? So that's one. Number two is I really do think that it's important that, in counter to say the DHS case, I think it's important that we do say, you should do this, you must do this in order to take advantage of the protections that this specification provides. If you don't want the full protections, again, back to what Pete was saying, right, you can make a local policy that lessens that. More power to you. But at the end of the day, if you want the protections that this provides, you say that. And then something else someone brought up earlier about ARC. Yeah, we have a lot of ARC data that basically points out that there are some use cases where it's incredibly useful. There's other use cases where it's less useful. We've seen no use cases where it's harmful. So, and off to the side, we have these conversations about how to employ ARC as an identifier in order to hang these things off of. I don't think it belongs in this document, but I'm happy to have folks ping me and we can work on that. So my time at the mic.
Thanks, Trent. And I will say that I feel like you are in the room with us. So all working. Victor.
Victor Duchovny. A disclaimer, I neither publish nor consume Dmarc, so you can discount whatever I say based on that. I do support the must not. I think it's a good idea. I also hope that the document contains somewhere text that makes it clear to people that just publishing P equals reject isn't a silver bullet to protect them from all impersonation attacks. Just the other day, my mother-in-law was reading an email and the display name said something about Apple. That's an email from Apple. So, the protection you get from P equals reject is rather limited in scope. And so because of that, if one has low value from it and expects too much from it, one is mostly doing a disservice to oneself.
Okay, so I'll have to channel Elizabeth on that one and say that, yes, the organizations that are doing that are well aware of that, but they find extremely high value in using P equals reject nevertheless. What Elizabeth told me one time was that it wasn't her decision and she wasn't happy with it, but in looking at the results, she would make the same decision if she had to make it because it's just been wonderful for them. And they're all aware that people are still getting fooled by lookalike domains and pretty names and whatever else. They're aware of it. Right. But I mean, I guess one of your points is write that in the document so it's clearer.
I'm less worried about the organizations who really know what they're doing.
Right. Understood. And so, yeah, maybe we could put a little extra text in for that. Jim.
Jim Fenton again. So some of you that are more operationally tied in than my tiny domain probably have more, know more about this. But I mean, we've been talking as though the breakage problem is limited to mailing lists.
Not
And-
entirely, but.
Right, but that's my point, is it isn't entirely. There are other situations, I think there are instances of recipient side forwarding, alumni domains, things of that sort, where you run into a problem as well. Those are not something that the originating domain is necessarily even aware of. And so we need to consider that, you know, telling the originating domain, don't publish p equals reject if you're sending to mailing lists, well, that isn't enough.
Yeah, I'll get an anecdote. The University of Florida shut down their alumni domain because they were having too much trouble with Dmarc. But that's not something any sender can control. You give them an alumni address to use, they use it, and it doesn't get to you because of Dmarc. They have no control over that. The one where they are using it on a domain where their users are regularly posting to email lists, that they have control of. And so that was my angle on it anyway. But okay, so we've had a lot of discussion on it. Is there any further discussion for the room? We'll obviously take it to the mailing list. Seth.
Not to touch on the other points and like the back and forth in the chat, but I think what I'm hearing is for mailing list interoperability, what we have in the document is not enough, and we do have to work out something in the list. And
Yes.
the form it takes is up for discussion, but that we must address this in the document is not up for discussion. We have to, and it's not sufficient in its current state.
Yes, that's what I get also. I'm seeing a lot of support for should not or must not, but we haven't completely addressed your concern about that yet. So, so yes, there's plenty of discussion to be had. Anything else? All right, next topic. Todd, I'll leave it to you here. Are there other issues you would like to discuss? And I'll just, while he's getting up, say that Todd just moved over some issues that we just shifted from the older data tracker tracking to GitHub tracking. So Todd got to move a few issues over from the old system, and go ahead.
Todd Hurt, I can't think of any issues that are currently in GitHub that are open that need to be addressed. There is one issue sort of burbling on the mailing list, some reformatting, rewording of section 4.8. I believe Scott answered my question about how the text should be rearranged. So we'll have to do, you know, the next rev will deal with that. It sounds like we still have some tweaks to make to the tree walk. Yes, John, is that what we came out of the other discussion, or no? Are we done with the tree walk?
No, I think the only thing with tree walk was that John and Seth were going to talk about the issue he raised and see
Right.
if any text needed to be changed for
Okay.
that. Otherwise, we think tree walk and the examples therewith are fine.
Right. So we'll have to propose some text for interoperability still and
Okay.
go from there. But I can't think of any issues outstanding right now.
So we appear to be very close to finishing this. Victor.
Since tree walk was mentioned and I just read it, I have a question more and more. It seems that it goes all the way up to, you know, .com, which seems rather silly in some ways. I imagine that's been discussed at length. I'm curious.
And so John says if there are not already TLDs with Dmarc records, there will be by the end of the year. So we do
This is for
need
the
to go back to the
brands?
TL.
Is that
Because
the
realize
idea?
.com may be silly, but .something else might not. So. Tim.
Tim Wasinski, talking about being complete. What I wanted to point out was there's two parts in the security consideration section, 10.3 and 10.4. 10.3 is on DNS security that I hope the DNS people like Victor and Wes and folks here will take a look at, and what John wrote looked good. And 10.4 is display name attacks, Victor. So 10.4 actually talks about display name attacks, which was something you had just mentioned. So you may want to look at that text and see if you can actually add some suggestions to that.
Okay, well, I mean, keeping in mind that when I say we're about done, I mean we're about ready for the last rounds of reviews. So yes, that will all be included. And we hope we will get a DNS review or several DNS reviews on it. Okay, so I think we are done discussing BIS. Is there anything else we need to discuss about Dmarc BIS?
I thought there was a section here, Barry, for any other nits, and Tim raised one in the chat in the middle of the last discussion, just around the IANA registry for the PSD flag.
Tim filed an issue with that, so that will be covered by the last edits. Alex. Okay, Alex will take his issue to the mailing list. Okay, so now for whatever time we have left, which appears to be about 15 minutes, do we have any discussion on the reporting docs that needs to happen? Alex?
I mean, I can't, I don't know what email address I used to register in the start.
Right, just wait till you get to the mic.
Alex Brotman, Comcast, editor for the aggregate document. So I've been kind of holding off, waiting to see some of the changes through tree walk and some of that to see how that might impact the aggregate document.
That's what I expected.
Yeah, and so I was talking with Todd a little bit. I don't think there's anything that is truly monumental that needs to be changed, but I'm certainly there are still some open tickets that need to be gone through. That needs to be probably discussed a little bit, but I don't know that any of them are extremely critical either. So.
Okay.
If anybody has anything else that they disagree with, I'm happy to, I'm here. You can smack me around the side of the head and that's fine. But that's the only one that I really know about. So.
Okay. Ale.
There were several proposals to adjust the syntax of the aggregate reports. So that they can be automatically verified with existing tools of XML syntax. And I hope sometime we will do that work in the working group.
Okay, Alex?
I know what he's talking about. I haven't gone back and done that. I don't know how much interest there is in having that done. The request is to have it so that it is, I think that the document basically auto verifies itself. Is that correct?
Pardon?
That might already be there, but if
Not off mic, please. So
John was asking about an RNG. I think one's compact, one's not. So those, but I don't think that's what Ali is asking about. I think there was something else, and there was a Google document out there somewhere that was created by I think Matt or Matthias, and I have to go find it again. If you want to send it to me, I will take another look at it. It might even be in a ticket. Is that correct? Ali?
Sorry,
It was in a Google Doc, correct? And then it never got merged in with anything else?
Yes, no, there were also some mails by Mark, if I remember well.
Okay, I'll see if I can find it.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
all right, and Ale, do you have anything you want to talk about with failure reporting?
I think it's quite all right. It's not much. Perhaps I would propose to only put the headers of the original message in the mail, because currently you can do both, and actually nobody does it as far as I saw. But there are privacy issues, and so it is seldom used. It's not. It is useful for organizations that start with Dmarc, putting hard policies. but very few people use failure reports. Still better than the SPF failure or the KIM failure reports that nobody does. But it looks all right like it is.
Todd and I were talking earlier this week about maybe like a header only version of reports first, so that you don't include the content. Even more so, you could potentially just include perhaps the message ID, so that they're, because there's still PII inside of the message headers. There's still the email address, or there could be something in the subject, those sorts of things. So if you were to include just the message ID, which I realize could be duplicated, that there's no requirement that it be unique, but at least it would give you something to potentially go back to the source IP and say, hey, do you know what these were? I don't know if that's sufficient in all cases, but hopefully it helps. But
Yeah, Pete, do you remember offhand what message ID, what guarantees there are on message ID being unique? Pete chuckles, and while he's coming up to the mic, Seth, what do you have to say?
Two things. One, there was an original ticket for stripped down failure reports, which was basically limiting it to header information, and it might be worthwhile to dust that off. But two, I think there's an RFC 6973 impact due to privacy on failure reports that we need to discuss. And so that's clearly, we're not going to have that discussion in 10 minutes. It's probably a list discussion, right. But I feel like that's a critical one. And frankly, the operational impact of almost no major mailbox sends failure reports. Some open source software does. And I believe Tencent out of China sends them, but there's no other source of them in the wild. And so from an operational perspective and a 6973 perspective, I think there's a real conversation to be had.
Okay. Well, we'll take that to the mailing list. Pete?
So this is Pete Resnick. The short answer is 5322 says must be globally unique. And here's some,
that's what I thought.
Here's some ways you might try and make that happen, but guarantee it does not.
Nothing is guaranteed.
Right, because it says you might want to use, append use a domain name on the right-hand side that you have control over, and so you can make sure what's on the left-hand side is globally unique.
Or just use a GUID for in the first
But even
place.
a GUID is not going to be guaranteed to be globally unique.
As I say, nothing is guaranteed. So yeah, but the point is that it is intended to be best effort unique. Yeah. So I think we can generally rely on them being unique for the purposes. Oh yeah. Alex says his point is the spammers don't care. They'll reuse whatever they feel like, and absolutely, of course. So, all right. Anyone else? Is there anything else we need to talk about related to Dmarc? Victor, don't bother putting yourself in the queue.
Thanks. Just one quick note about tree walking and IDNA. If I remember correctly, IDNA introduces at least 2, maybe 3 additional label separating period characters. So that when you're parsing a domain name, they can be separated by period or ideographic full stops or a couple of other weird
Punycode, it should stick with everything.
No, Punycode is inside the label.
Yeah, but
these are between the labels.
You'll be converting to A labels.
No, not those. Did they? But there's
John's. Wait.
Yeah.
John, let me just. No, you can stay up at the mic. I'm just repeating John's answer. Is that he thinks that what Victor was just talking about is in 2003 IDNA, not 2008.
Yeah, I was checking.
This is a pit. This is a hopeless pit. The IDN punctuation is a pit of hopeless despair that I don't think we should. I don't think we should get into. I think anybody who knows how to turn U labels into A labels will have their own opinions about what dots to look for, and I don't think we need to talk about it.
And as someone else who knows about IDNA, I agree with John. So, and Victor is perusing RFCs right now, so he might jump back up. While he's doing that, is there anything else anyone would like to say? Hearing nothing, we have 6 minutes left. Let's give another, Victor, do you need another minute to look at stuff?
I'll follow up on the list.
Okay, anything further will be taken to the list on that point. So seeing nothing else, I think we have now 5 minutes back to our afternoon. Thank you everybody for coming, and especially thanks to the people who came remotely, and if you're in Europe, thanks for coming late in the evening.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you again to the editors for pulling everything together and making such rapid changes.
So this is the thing. 2008 doesn't recognize the separator. Because it specifies